The fjord lay still beneath a ceiling of grey, the kind of morning when sky and water seem to forget which is which. Mist moved low across the surface, thick in places, thin in others, drifting the way breath drifts from a sleeping animal. Nothing hurried here. The mountains that rose on either side had become suggestions rather than shapes, their granite shoulders folded into cloud, and where the light did manage to reach the water, it came pale and reluctant, as though the sun itself were unsure whether this was a morning worth arriving for. At the edge of this stillness, tied to a landing of dark, water-softened timber, a ship waited. She rested low against the current, her hull dark with damp, beads of moisture clinging to the seams of her planking like small, unspoken thoughts. The rope that held her to the landing post had gone taut and loose and taut again through the night, the tide breathing beneath her in slow rhythm. And now, in this hour before anyone had come to wake her crew, she simply sat upon the grey water, patient in the way that only wood and sea can be patient, waiting for hands that had not yet arrived. This was a world that measured its days not by clocks, but by the position of the sun against a ridge, by the smell of the wind, by the particular grey of a morning like this one. It was the late 8th century moving toward the 9th, and further still toward the 10th and 11th. 3 centuries in which the northern edge of Europe lived a life shaped almost entirely by water. Farmsteads sat scattered along the fjords like handfuls of grain thrown loosely across a dark cloth, each one small, self-contained, tied to its neighbours not by road, for there were few roads worth the name, but by the sea itself. The sea was the only true road here. It connected valley to valley, kin to kin, chieftain to chieftain, and in the right season it stretched outward into distances that most of those farmstead families would never see themselves, though they would hear of them in fragments from men who returned changed by what they had found. It was a world of chieftains whose authority rested as much on the loyalty of their oarsmen as on any inherited claim. A world where a man's worth might be measured by the strength of his ship as readily as by the strength of his sword arm. Winters were long and close, spent indoors among smoke and firelight, mending nets, sharpening blades, telling and retelling stories that would, in time, be carried further than any of the tellers could imagine. Summers belonged to the water, and when summer came, when the ice had receded from the smaller inlets and the winds had settled into something a ship could trust, it was the ships, narrow, oaken, dragon-headed, that carried the ambitions of an entire people outward into the unknown. The ship at the landing was one of these. She was clinker-built, her hull formed of overlapping oak planks, each one riveted to the next, in a pattern that gave her both flexibility and strength, allowing her to flex with the sea rather than resist it, to bend into a wave rather than break against it. Her keel ran the length of her like a spine, cut from a single length of oak chosen with more care than most men chose their wives. For a ship's life, and the lives of all who sailed her, depended on that one piece of timber, holding true against years of water and weather. Where her prow rose from the mist, it curved upward into the likeness of a dragon's head, its features simplified by the carver's hand into something more suggestion than portrait. A jaw, a brow, eyes that had been carved to stare forward into whatever waited beyond the horizon. Some said such carvings were meant to frighten the spirits of unfamiliar coastlines. Others said they were meant to frighten nothing at all, and existed simply because a ship without ornament felt like a ship without a soul, and no crew wished to trust their lives to something soulless. Amidships her sail lay furled and bound against the yard, though even bound it hinted at its own presence. A great square of woven wool, dyed in broad stripes of red and undyed cream, or sometimes blue where the dye had been available and the owner wealthy enough to afford it, unfurled, That sail would catch the wind and pull the ship forward with a strength that oars alone could never match. But for now it slept, wound tight, waiting like everything else in this hour for the moment when hands would come to wake it. The silence around her was not empty. It had texture, if a listener cared to notice it. The rope at her stern creaked softly each time the tide shifted her weight, a low wooden sound, almost a sigh, the kind of noise old ships make simply by existing. Somewhere above, hidden in the mist, gulls called to one another in short, flat notes, their voices carrying oddly in the damp air, seeming closer than they were, then further, then closer again. The cold had a physical weight to it this early, the kind that settled into a man's chest and made itself known each time he exhaled, his breath rising in front of him in small, pale clouds before dispersing into the larger fog around him. There was frost, faint and easily missed, silvering the edges of the landing's timbers, and the smell of wood smoke drifting faintly from a farmstead somewhere back along the shore. Someone already awake, already tending a fire against the morning's chill. No one had come to the ship yet. That would happen soon enough. Men emerging from low, turf-roofed halls, cloaks drawn tight, breath visible, boots finding familiar paths worn smooth by years of the same walk to the same landing. But for this hour, she belonged only to the water and the mist and the gulls, resting the way a living thing rests before a long effort it has not yet begun to feel. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet hour, to consider how little truly separates the person listening to this story now from the men and women who once stood on landings like this one, waiting for dawn to lift enough mist to make departure possible. The sea that lapped against that hull is the same sea, chemically and physically unchanged in any way that would matter to a sailor's hands. The stars that would have guided that ship once darkness returned, had the crew sailed through night rather than day, are the same stars, burning in the same places, indifferent to the centuries that separate that morning from this one. The cold that settled into a Viking oarsman's chest as he waited on a landing, much like this one, is the same cold that might settle into anyone's chest on a foggy morning by open water today. Time changes a great many things. It has not yet found a way to change the sea, or the sky above it, or the particular quality of silence that gathers over still water at first light. In this way, this story is not so distant as it may first appear. It happened long ago, yes, but it happened beneath the same grey sky that might be outside a window even now. If stories like this one, quiet histories of ships and voyages, told slowly without hurry, are the kind of company you find comforting on a night like tonight, you are welcome to subscribe to this channel, where more such histories wait to be told, each one drawn from the long, patient record of the sea and those who trusted themselves to it. There is no urgency in that invitation. It will still be here when this story ends and when the next one begins. For now, the ship remains at her landing, and the fjord remains grey, and nothing yet has moved to break the stillness. Soon there will be footsteps on the timber landing, voices low and half-formed with sleep. The particular sounds of men preparing themselves for a journey whose ending none of them can yet see. Soon there will be the work of untying ropes, of testing the wind's direction with a wetted finger held up into the grey air, of checking supplies stowed carefully beneath the deck boards. Dried fish, hard bread, water in skins, tools for repair, weapons wrapped and secured against the damp. Soon the ship herself will begin to feel the particular shift in her balance that comes when weight is added, when men climb aboard and settle themselves at their oars, when the vessel that has rested so patiently against the tide finally begins to answer to purpose again. But that is still to come. For this hour, in this fog, on this water, everything remains still. The dragon-headed prow stares forward into mist it cannot yet see through. The oak planks hold their moisture and their silence. The rope creaks, the gulls call, and somewhere back along the shoreline, smoke rises thin and grey from a hall where a crew is only now beginning to stir, unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned, that the sea they are about to enter will remember this morning long after they themselves have been forgotten. The water does not hurry. It never has. It simply waits, the way it has always waited, for those willing to trust it with everything they have. To understand why the ship waited so patiently in that grey water, one must go back further still, to the forests above the fjord, where her life began not as a vessel but as a stand of oaks, rooted in soil that had fed them for 100 years or more. The men who would become her builders did not choose these trees carelessly. They walked among them in late autumn, when the sap had withdrawn deep into the roots and the wood had grown hard and slow with the coming cold. For oak felled in this season resisted rot in a way that spring-cut timber never could. A tree taken in the wrong month might serve for firewood or fencing, but it would never carry a crew through open water and bring them home again. The shipwrights understood this the way a farmer understands weather, not as superstition, but as memory passed down through calloused hands and quiet observation, generation folding into generation until the knowledge became indistinguishable from instinct. They did not saw the oak. This is a detail easily lost to those who have never stood in a boatyard and watched the old way done, but it mattered more than almost anything else in the ship's making. A sawn plank cuts across the wood's own grain, severing the long fibers that give timber its strength, leaving a board that will crack along invisible fault lines the first time the sea truly tests it. A split plank does something different. The shipwrights drove wedges into the felled trunk along its natural grain, coaxing the wood to separate where it wanted to separate, following the lines that had grown there since the tree was a sapling, reaching for light through the canopy above it. What resulted was a plank still whole in its fibers, still carrying the tree's original strength from root end to crown, flexible in a way sawn wood could never be. And it was this flexibility, this willingness to bend without breaking, that would one day let the ship ride over swells that might have shattered a more rigid hull. The work was slow. A single trunk might yield only a handful of usable planks, and the splitting itself required strength and patience in equal measure. Two men working wedges and mallets for the better part of a day to free wood that a saw might have taken an hour to cut, badly, into something weaker. Once split, the planks were shaped with axes, not sanded, not planed in the way later centuries would come to expect, but hewn with broad strokes that left faint ripples in the wood's surface. Ripples still visible along ships pulled from bogs and riverbeds 1,000 years later, as if the axe marks themselves had refused to fade. The shipwright's eye was the only measuring tool that mattered. There were no standardized units, no diagrams passed between yards. A master builder carried the ship's shape in his mind and in the muscle memory of his hands, and he communicated dimension, not through numbers, but through comparison. This plank matched against that one. This curve matched against the curve of his own forearm. This thickness tested by feel and by the particular sound the wood made when struck. It was a craft learned by watching, by making small mistakes on small boats before ever being trusted with something meant to cross open water. And a young apprentice might spend a decade at a master's side before his own hands were judged steady enough to shape a ship's principal timbers. The hull itself rose plank upon plank in a manner called clinker building, each strake overlapping the one below it like the shingles of a roof turned sideways to face the sea. And this overlapping was no mere decoration. It gave the hull a way of flexing that a flush-built ship could never achieve. The whole structure working slightly with each wave, absorbing the water's pressure rather than resisting it outright, the way a reed bends in wind while a rigid branch snaps. The strakes were fastened with iron rivets, hammered through from the outside and secured on the inside with small rectangular plates called roves. And the driving of each rivet was its own small ceremony of patience. Too loose, and the plank would work free in the first serious weather. Too tight, and the wood might split along the grain the builders had worked so hard to preserve. The rivet had to be driven with exactly enough force to draw the planks snug without denying them the freedom to move against each other as the ship breathed with the sea beneath her. And a good rivet man could tell by the sound of his own hammer whether the joint was drawing true, an ear trained through years of listening to iron meat oak. Between the strakes, the shipwrights pressed wool soaked in pine tar, or sometimes animal hair worked into the same sticky resin, caulking the seams against the water's constant searching. This too was not a task rushed. The tar had to be heated to precisely the right consistency, thin enough to work into the narrow gap between planks, thick enough to hold once it cooled, and a builder who hurried this step might find his work undone by the first hard crossing. The sea finding its way in through a seam that looked sound but had never truly sealed. The whole hull, once assembled, was a structure built not against the sea's movement but in agreement with it. Every plank chosen, split, shaped and fastened to flex together as one long breathing form, so that in heavy water the ship did not fight the waves so much as absorb and pass along their force, twisting almost imperceptibly from bow to stern in a way that would have alarmed a passenger unfamiliar with her nature, but which the builders had intended from the very first felling of the oak. The design itself answered a question the sea and the land both asked of it. A longship needed to run up a shallow river as easily as it crossed open ocean, needed to carry a crew and their gear without riding so heavy that oars became useless, needed speed under sail when the wind cooperated, and speed under oar when it did not. This demanded a shallow draft, a hull that sat light in the water, drawing only a few feet even when loaded, so that a captain might sail her far up a river most vessels could never approach, beaching her on a gravel bank as easily as a fishing boat, then withdrawing again before any defense could be mounted. Yet that same shallow hull had to withstand the open sea's heavier moods, had to carry a mast and sail capable of driving her forward at speeds that still impress those who study her design today, had to hold a crew of 30 or more men along with their weapons, their provisions, their trade goods. Without buckling under weight, she was never sawn or forged to bear, only grown and shaped and coaxed into bearing. That the shipwrights achieved this balance at all, speed and strength and shallow grace all in one hull, speaks to a mastery of wood that no written record could ever fully explain. A knowledge held not in books, but in the hands themselves. At the prow, where the ship's two lives, rivercraft and ocean vessel, seemed to meet most visibly, the builders often carved a head, a serpent, coiled and watchful, a dragon, jaws parted as if already tasting salt air. These carvings were not mere decoration either, though they were beautiful in their own severe way, the wood grain following the curve of a beast's neck, as though the animal had always lived within the oak, waiting only to be freed by a careful hand. The carved head was believed to ward off the spirits of the deep, the unseen things that were thought to inhabit fogbanks and sudden swells, the presences sailors blamed when a calm sea turned, without warning, into something else. Some ships bore removable heads, taken down when approaching a friendly shore so as not to frighten the local spirits of that particular coast, and raised again only when returning to open, hostile, unclaimed water. It was a practice that reveals as much about the sailor's relationship with the sea as any account of storms or currents, a sense that the water was not empty, that it held presences worth respecting, worth negotiating with through carved wood and careful ceremony, long before the first wave ever struck the hull. And when the ship was finished, planked, riveted, caulked, carved, her mast raised and her rigging strung, she was given a name. This was never an idle formality. A longship's name was chosen to carry meaning, to invoke fortune, speed, ferocity, or protection. And the naming itself was often accompanied by a blessing, sometimes involving blood, sometimes ale, sometimes simply words spoken over the bow by the ship's captain or a figure of some spiritual standing within the community. From that moment, the vessel was treated less as an object and more as a companion, an extension of her captain's own fortune, her successes and failures spoken of in the same breath as his. Her name remembered by those who sailed in her long after individual voyages had blurred together in memory. A ship that brought her crew home again and again earned a kind of reputation separate from her captain's own, spoken of by other crews with the particular respect reserved for something that had proven through repeated trial that she could be trusted with human lives. It was this ship, built through such patient, deliberate craft, that now sat waiting in the grey water of the fjord, her dragon-carved prow still and silent, her clinker-built hull holding within it every choice her makers had made. The season of the felling, the grain of the split planks, the exact tension of each driven rivet, the tar pressed carefully into every seam. She did not yet know, if a ship can be said to know anything, what water she would cross or what weather she would meet. But she had been built, plank by plank, precisely for the uncertainty that lay ahead, shaped by hands that understood the sea not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner whose moods required respect, patience, and a vessel willing to bend rather than break. The man who would command her had a name that has survived, in one form or another, on a runestone half buried in the moss of a churchyard, and in the memory of families who still tell the old accounts as though they happened to a grandfather's grandfather rather than to strangers 1,000 years gone. Call him Thorvald, though the name matters less than the shape of the life it carried. He was neither young nor old, perhaps 42 winters, which in that world was already a long life, long enough to have buried a wife and raised sons, and buried one of those sons as well, long enough to have crossed open water more times than he could easily count, and to have learned, in the slow accumulation of small disasters and small mercies, what a man could and could not control once the land fell away behind him. His reputation had not been built on a single voyage or a single victory. It had accumulated the way frost accumulates on a rope left out overnight, quietly, in layers, until one morning the whole thing was simply understood to be there. Men said of him that he did not gamble with weather, that he turned back when turning back cost him standing but saved him ships, that he had brought crews home from 3 separate voyages without losing a single free man to the sea, though the sea had taken thralls, and no one had thought to count those losses with the same care. This was not unusual. It was simply how the ledger of a voyage was kept. He sailed now for reasons that were, like most reasons men give for crossing water, several things at once and none of them simple. There was a debt owed to him by a kinsman across the sea, a debt in silver and in obligation both, and there was a daughter recently married into a family whose farm bordered a good harbour. And there was, beneath these practical accountings, something harder to name, a restlessness that came on him in the dark months, a sense that a man who had spent his life on ships was not suited to spending what remained of it watching the same fjord freeze and thaw. He had told his household he sailed for trade. He had not told them, because he had not fully told himself, that he sailed because the alternative was to stay, and staying had begun to feel like a kind of drowning of its own sort. The crew he had gathered were some 35 souls, which was neither a small company nor an especially large one, but enough to work the oars in shifts and still leave men free to fight or bail or mend as the voyage required. They were not soldiers in any sense a later age would recognize, and they were not sailors in the sense of men who knew no other trade. They were, nearly to a man, farmers, men who had spent the autumn bringing in barley and the winter mending fences and slaughtering what stock could not be fed through to spring, and who now, in the turning of the year toward the sailing months, set aside the plough for the oar with the same unremarkable practicality with which they might have set aside a broken tool for a whole one. The ship was simply another season's work, dangerous in ways the field was not, but familiar in its demands: strength, patience, the willingness to do a hard thing for many hours without complaint. Among them were men whose reputations ran the other direction from farming. Two brothers known to have fought in the service of a jarl 3 winters past. Men who wore the marks of that service in scars along the forearm, and a certain economy of movement that farmers did not have. Men who would be trusted first if the voyage turned to raiding rather than trade. Though no one aboard said this aloud, because to say it aloud was to invite the fate it named. And among them too were the boys. 3 of them, none past 16 winters, sons of men who had sailed with Thorvald before, and who had asked, in the particular quiet way such requests were made, that their sons be given a place aboard, a place to prove that a boy could become, over the length of one hard voyage, something closer to a man. Each soul aboard had been given a task before the ship ever left her mooring, and the tasks were not assigned carelessly, because a ship that assigned her labor carelessly was a ship that drowned carelessly as well. There were rowers, of course, nearly all of them in the end, for a longship at sea was a vessel of shared labor, and even the captain would take an oar when the wind failed and the arms of lesser men grew tired. But beyond the general labor of rowing, there were men set apart for particular skills. One older man, missing 2 fingers from a rope that had run wrong years before, was given charge of the sail and its rigging, for he had spent more hours than any other man aboard learning how a square sail took the wind and how it could be coaxed or fought depending on what the sky demanded. Another, a broad, quiet man named for his father's father, stood near the stern with Thorvald and shared in the reading of the water, the color of it, the shape of the swells, the particular restlessness of birds that signaled land or storm before either could be seen. A third had charge of the stores, the barrels and sacks that would keep 35 men fed and watered for as many days as the crossing required. And his was a labor that began not at sea but weeks before, in the counting and recounting of what the ship could carry and what the voyage would demand. Beneath this ordering of skilled roles ran a deeper and older ordering, one that governed who ate first and who ate last, who slept dry and who slept wet, who could speak freely in council and who could only listen. Most aboard were free men, farmers or sons of farmers who owed loyalty to Thorvald by custom and by the practical understanding that a ship's captain held authority the way a household's head held authority, not by decree alone, but by the constant, quiet consent of those who followed him, a consent that could be withdrawn if he led them badly enough, often enough, into loss. But 3 aboard were thralls, men without the freedom the others carried as birthright, bound to labor without the voice in council that free men held. They rowed the same oars and bailed the same water and would drown if the sea took the ship, in the same cold that took everyone else. But their names would not be carved into any stone, and no saga would trouble itself with what they thought of the crossing. This was the order of things, and no one aboard, thrall or free, thought to question it any more than they questioned the tide. Thorvald's authority sat atop this order, but did not float free of it. He could command the ship's course, but he could not simply command the crew's will. And every captain worth the name understood that a voyage undertaken against the quiet consensus of the men who rowed it was a voyage already halfway to disaster. He consulted his steersman. He listened, more than a stranger might expect, To the older farmers who had crossed this water before and who carried in memory the particular temperament of this stretch of sea in this season, authority, aboard a longship, was less a throne than a rope, strong only so long as every hand along its length continued to hold it. The loading of the ship, in the days before departure, had its own unhurried rhythm, and it was in this labor that the voyage first became real to those who would undertake it. Barrels of fresh water were rolled down to the shore and set into the hold, wedged tight against the ship's ribs so they would not shift and split in rough water. Dried fish, salted and hard as old leather, were packed in sacks alongside rounds of cheese and stores of grain. Food chosen not for pleasure but for its stubborn refusal to spoil. Wool bedding, coarse and already smelling of the animals it had come from, was rolled and stowed where it would stay driest, though every man aboard understood that little on this ship would remain truly dry for long. Weapons, axes, spears, the occasional sword belonging to a man of some means, were wrapped in oiled cloth against the salt air and laid where they could be reached quickly but would not foul the footing of men working the oars. It was on the morning before departure that an old man, father to one of the 3 boys sailing for the first time, came down to the shore not to load anything but simply to stand near his son while the boy worked. He said little. What he did say has survived, roughly, in the fragment of a memorial raised somewhere in the north. Words carved by a family for a son who did not return from some crossing much like this one. Words that later travelers copied down before the stone wore smooth. That he raised this stone for his son, who went east and did not come home, and that no father should have to raise such a stone, but that the sea does not ask a father's permission before it takes what it takes. The old man on the shore that morning did not speak these words, for they had not yet been carved by anyone's grief. But he stood the way a man stands who has already imagined the possibility they contain, and he said only that the boy should mind the steersman and keep his hands away from the rail in rough water and come home. The boy said he would. Neither of them dwelt on it longer than that, because there was cargo yet to load, and a tide that would not wait on any man's sentiment, however earned. The order to depart came not as a shout, but as a nod, passed from the captain to the man at the mast, and from him down the length of the ship in a ripple of small movements that needed no translation into words. This was how it was done, and had always been done, on vessels where the space between men was too narrow for anything but economy of gesture. The mooring lines were drawn in, coiled by hands that did not need to look at what they were doing, and the ship, for one held breath, simply drifted, untethered from the land for the first time in weeks, rocking gently on water that still remembered the shelter of the fjord's high walls. Then the oars came down. They did not come down all at once, in the way a landsman might imagine, a great crash of wood meeting water in ragged unison. They came down in a wave, one bench after another, timed by the low call of the man who kept the rhythm, so that watching from the shore, one might have seen the oars descend like the wing beats of some enormous, segmented bird, learning for the first time how its own body worked. The blades bit the water, the shafts flexed, and the ship, so still and so heavy-seeming a moment before, began to move. It did not move quickly. This is a thing that surprises those who have only heard of longships in the tales told around fires, where they seem to fly across the water with the speed of something summoned rather than rowed. In truth, the first movement of a laden ship, deep in the belly with cargo and men and the waterskins and the salted stores that would keep them through weeks at sea, was a slow and deliberate thing, more akin to the first steps of a large animal roused from rest than to any kind of flight. The oars dipped and pulled, and the hull answered with a shudder that ran from the stem to the stern. A shudder the men aboard felt in their feet and their knees before they felt it anywhere else. And the ship eased forward, foot by foot, out of the water that had cradled it through the fitting out and toward the current of the fjord itself, which waited beyond the calm like a wider and less patient sea. The oars found their unison quickly, as they had been trained to. Each pull was a small negotiation between 30 men and the water and the wood beneath them. But it settled, as it always settled, into something that no longer required negotiation at all. A rhythm, low and steady, the blades entering and leaving the water with a sound that was less a splash than a soft, continuous exhalation. In and out, so that a man standing on the cliffs above might have mistaken it, if the wind was right, for the sound of the fjord itself breathing. The land began to slide past. This was the part of departure that a man remembered longest, though he could rarely say afterward why it moved him so, only that it did. The steep walls of the fjord, which for the whole of the winter and the spring had stood as the entire visible boundary of the world, now began to reveal themselves as something that could be left behind, could be watched receding rather than simply lived beneath. The cliffs, grey and green and streaked here and there with the pale trace of falling water, rose sheer on either side, and where they broke, briefly, into gentler slopes, a man could see the scattered farms that clung to whatever soil the mountains had permitted, small huddles of turf-roofed buildings, a scrap of cultivated ground, a handful of sheep moving across a hillside like slow grey stones come loose and wandering. From one or two of these farms, thin lines of smoke rose into the cold morning air, straight for a moment before the wind above the ridge caught them and bent them sideways, smearing them into a haze that dissolved before it reached the height of the cliffs. The men aboard did not speak much of what they saw, though a few eyes lingered on this farm or that hall, on the specific curl of a particular smoke line, because a man might have kin in that hall, or a wife who would watch that same smoke rise from her own hearth fire long after the ship was gone from sight. And there was a kind of privacy in watching land recede that did not want to be interrupted by talk. The ship itself, moving now at its working pace, had a motion unlike anything else that carried men upon water, and those who had spent time aboard other vessels, the broader merchant boats, the rivercraft, even the smaller boats used for fishing close to shore, remarked, when they remarked on anything at all, that nothing quite prepared a man for what it felt like to ride in a longship built for the sea. She sat low in the water, her sides not much higher than a man's waist in places, so that the sea itself seemed always close, always present, a thing one could reach down and touch, rather than a thing observed from a safe remove. And she was not rigid. This was the detail that unsettled newcomers most, and that veterans had long since come to trust as the very thing that kept them alive. The hull flexed as it moved, the long lines of overlapping planks working against one another with a give that could be felt through the soles of the feet and through the palms laid flat against the sheer strake, a living flex that some likened to the working of a great rib cage, and others simply called breathing, because there was no better word for a solid thing that moved as if it had lungs. Underway, the whole vessel seemed to twist very slightly along its length, with each swell that passed beneath it, a slow serpentine motion that a man's body learned to answer without being told to, shifting weight from one foot to the other in time with a rhythm that had no name, but that every sailor's legs came to know as well as they knew the rhythm of walking on solid ground. It was this flex, this deliberate looseness in a hull that might otherwise have shattered against a heavy sea, that let her ride waves other, stiffer ships would have fought and lost against. The men did not think of it in these terms, not consciously, but they trusted it, the way a man trusts a bridge he has crossed many times without asking exactly how it holds his weight. Why they had put to sea at all was a question that had many possible answers, and on this particular voyage, as on many, no one aboard would have thought it strange that not all of the men could have given the same one. There were those in the crew whose interest was purely in trade, men who carried in their minds a map of harbours and markets stretching south and west, who thought in terms of furs and amber and the iron goods that might be exchanged for silver or for cloth or for the kind of drink that did not exist in their own colder country. There were others for whom the voyage carried a different weight, an edge sharpened by old grievance or new ambition, men who kept their weapons close and oiled, and who spoke, when they spoke at all, of coastlines less well defended than their own. And there were a few, fewer perhaps, but present on nearly every ship that made a long crossing, who thought less of profit or plunder than of land itself. Empty land, or land they had heard described as empty, where a man without inheritance in his own crowded valley might carve out something that would belong to him, and, after him, to his sons. The captain knew which of these purposes drove his own voyage, though he had not announced it to the whole crew in so many words. For a captain rarely needed to explain himself so plainly to men who had signed on already knowing, in the way that such things were always known, what kind of venture they were joining. It is enough to say that the voyage held within it something of all these possibilities, as most voyages did, and that the specific balance between trade and raid and the search for new ground was a thing that might shift, quietly according to what the ship found when it arrived, and according to what defences it discovered waiting, and according to 100 small decisions that had not yet been made, because the circumstances that would demand them had not yet arisen. The fjord narrowed once more before it opened, as fjords so often do, funneling the ship between two final walls of stone before releasing it, without ceremony, into water that no longer had the shape of a channel, but stretched instead toward a horizon undivided by any cliff. This was the moment, not the casting off from the shore, not the first pull of the oars, that the men understood as the true leaving. Here the colour of the water changed, the sheltered green-grey of the fjord giving way to a deeper, colder blue that carried within it the memory of much larger distances. Here the wind, which had been broken and turned by the high stone walls, arrived instead in a long, unbroken sweep that had crossed uncounted miles of open water to reach them, and the men felt it first on the backs of their necks, and then, as the ship turned to take advantage of it, full against their faces. It was here, at this threshold, that the singing began. Not loud, not the boastful chanting that might accompany a return with plunder or a departure into battle, but something lower and more private. A few voices at first, then more, offering the old words to Njord for calm water and fair wind, and to Aegir, whose temper the sea itself was thought to embody, that he might look elsewhere for his amusements during the weeks the ship would spend upon his back. The words were old enough that no man aboard could have said who first shaped them, and the melody, if it could be called that, moved more like a tide than like a song, rising and falling without urgency, matched loosely to the stroke of the oars, so that the singing and the rowing became, for a while, the same motion expressed in two different registers. Land was still visible behind them, a grey smudge low against the horizon, the last suggestion of the cliffs that had sheltered them. But it was already the kind of visibility that a man understood as temporary, already thinning at its edges as morning gave way toward the flatter light of midday. No one aboard watched it disappear entirely, by unspoken agreement or perhaps simple necessity, for there was cargo to check and rope to coil, and the specific business of settling into a rhythm meant to be held for many hours. The crew turned their attention forward, toward the water that lay ahead of them, grey and moving and entirely indifferent to whatever purpose had sent them out upon it. That rhythm, once settled, revealed itself as something almost musical in its repetition, a pattern of exertion and rest that the ship itself seemed to breathe in and out as the oars rose and fell against the grey water. The rowers did not row without pause for hours on end, as some who had never set foot upon such a vessel might imagine. Instead, the work was divided, apportioned among the crew in shifts that allowed a man to labor at the oar for a stretch of time, measured not by any clock, but by the sun's slow crossing, or by the particular ache that settled into the shoulders and told him, more reliably than any instrument, that his turn had come to rest. When that ache arrived, he would lift the oar free of its rest, pass it into the waiting hands of the man beside him, and settle himself somewhere along the length of the hull where he might catch his breath, drink from the water cask, or simply watch the coastline that no longer showed itself. Watch instead the unbroken grey that had replaced it. The watches kept through the night followed their own quieter logic. A ship at sea could not simply close its eyes and drift until morning, not with rocks that might lie unseen beneath the surface, not with the ever-present possibility of another vessel's shadow crossing their path in darkness, not with the wind itself capable of shifting its temper without warning. And so men took turns remaining awake, 2 or 3 at a time, seated near the stern or braced against the mast, their eyes adjusting to whatever light the sky offered. Starlight when the clouds permitted it, the pale wash of a moon half hidden, or on the darkest nights, nothing at all but the sound of water and the felt motion of the hull beneath them, which a practiced sailor could read almost as well as sight. These men spoke little during their watches, not from any rule that forbade it, but because the work of watching demanded a kind of stillness that conversation would have disturbed. They listened. They felt the wind against their cheeks and adjusted their sense of direction accordingly. They watched for the particular darkness that might indicate cloud gathering ahead, or for the faint paleness along the horizon that meant land, however distant. The captain's own vigilance ran deeper than these rotating watches, for it was upon him that the larger burden of navigation rested, and he carried it not through any instrument more sophisticated than his own trained perception. He read the stars when they showed themselves, tracking the position of certain fixed points against the ship's heading, adjusting his sense of their progress according to calculations that lived entirely within his memory and experience rather than upon any chart. He read the swells as well, for the sea did not move uniformly in all directions. Certain patterns of wave and current ran consistently along particular stretches of open water, patterns a captain who had sailed these routes many times before could recognize by feel alone, the way a man recognizes the particular unevenness of a familiar road beneath his feet, even in complete darkness. He would stand near the stern for long stretches, saying little, his attention divided between the sky above and the water beneath, piecing together from these two sources of information a sense of where they were and where they were likely to be carried if the wind held its current temper. The meals taken aboard reflected the same economy that governed every other aspect of life within the ship's narrow hull. There was no fire to be lit at sea, no warm broth simmering over coals, for a flame aboard a wooden vessel built low against the water represented a danger too great to risk except in the direst circumstances or when anchored safely near shore. And so the food that sustained the crew through their days and weeks at sea was food that required no preparation beyond what had already been done before departure. Hard bread, baked dense and dry enough to survive the journey without spoiling, meant to be softened sometimes in water or simply gnawed at with strong teeth until it yielded. Dried meat, salted and preserved through methods practiced for generations. Tough and stringy but rich enough in substance to provide the strength a rowing man required. Sour milk, kept in skins or small casks, its souring not a failure of preservation but the intended result, for milk treated in this way could last considerably longer than milk left in its original state, and the crew had grown accustomed to its particular sharpness, had perhaps even come to find comfort in its familiar bite against the tongue after a long shift at the oar. There was little variety in this diet, and less still as the days accumulated and the supplies carried aboard began their slow, inevitable diminishment. A man ate what was given to him, in the portion allotted, and did not complain of its plainness, for he understood the mathematics that governed such matters, that every open hull carried only so much, that space given to food was space not given to cargo or to the men themselves, that the voyage's success depended upon calculations made carefully before ever leaving harbour, calculations that left little room for indulgence. Meals were taken where a man happened to be sitting, eaten with the fingers or a small personal knife, swallowed quickly between one duty and the next, for the ship did not pause its progress to accommodate anyone's hunger. When the time came to sleep, and it came for each man only in fragments, stolen between watches or rowing shifts, the arrangements were as simple and as close as everything else about shipboard life. Bedrolls were laid beneath the sheer strakes, the raised sides of the hull that offered some small measure of shelter from wind and spray, though never enough to keep a man entirely dry on a night when the sea ran rough. Men slept pressed near to one another, not by any particular design, but because the ship's narrow beam left no space for the luxury of distance, and in truth, the shared warmth that resulted from this proximity was no small comfort on nights when the air carried a bitter edge. A man might wake in darkness to find another's shoulder against his own, another's breath audible nearby, and think nothing of it, for this was simply the nature of the vessel that carried them, a nature that made strangers into something closer to kin through sheer repeated contact. The sound that accompanied every hour of sleep, waking or otherwise, was the water against the wood, a constant presence that a man ceased to notice consciously after the first day or two, yet which shaped his rest all the same, a rhythm beneath rhythm. The hull's slow response to each wave that met it translated into sound and motion that became, in time, almost indistinguishable from silence itself. Some men claimed they slept better at sea than they ever did on solid ground, lulled by this endless conversation between water and wood. Though whether this was truth or simply the exhaustion of hard labour, finding whatever rest it could, none could say with certainty. The days held small routines beyond rowing and watching and eating, routines that filled the hours when a man's hands might otherwise have sat idle, and idleness aboard a working vessel was rare and generally unwelcome. Sails required mending, for the wind's constant pressure wore at seams and fabric in ways that demanded regular attention, and a man skilled with needle and thread might spend an afternoon repairing some small tier before it grew into something larger. Blades needed sharpening, not only the weapons that a crew of this nature inevitably carried, but the smaller knives used in daily tasks, kept keen against a whetstone, carried for exactly this purpose. Idle wood, scraps gathered or carried for the purpose, found its way into carving. Simple shapes, sometimes practical, a toggle or a small tool, sometimes purely decorative, a pattern worked into the surface for no reason beyond the pleasure of the working itself, a way of occupying restless hands and a restless mind during the long stretches when the sea offered nothing new to look at. And there were quieter pleasures too, games played with what materials were at hand, small wagers made and settled with laughter, more often than dispute, songs sung low between men who had learned one another's voices, well enough to know when to join and when to let a single singer carry a verse alone. These songs were not always about the sea or the voyage itself. Sometimes they recalled homes left behind, women waiting, children growing without their fathers present to see it. Other times they were simply old songs, carried forward from childhood, sung now not for their meaning, but for the comfort of their familiar shape. It was this closeness, this constant, unavoidable nearness of one man to another, that gave shipboard life its particular character, an intimacy that went beyond mere proximity into something closer to a shared existence. These were men who would eat from the same stores, sleep within arm's reach of one another, stand watch together through the darkest hours, and if circumstance demanded it, fight side by side against whatever threat the voyage might produce. For weeks at a stretch, the entire world available to them consisted of this narrow wooden hull and the water surrounding it, and within that world, every human need for food, for rest, for companionship, for the small dignities of routine and ritual, was met in view of one another, without privacy, without distance, without the luxury of solitude that men on land might take for granted. They came to know each other's habits, each other's small comforts, each other's silences, in a way that few relationships beyond this shared vessel could ever produce. And though the voyage had scarcely begun, though the fair weather that carried them now would not last forever, this intimacy had already begun its quiet work, binding a crew of individual men into something that functioned in the hours that mattered most, as a single body moving together across the grey and patient sea. To read the sea was to read a language that had no letters, no fixed grammar, only patterns that revealed themselves slowly to those willing to watch for years without complaint. The captain of a longship carried no chart in his hands, no needle floating in a bowl of water to point him towards some fixed direction. What he carried instead was memory, layered and cross-checked, a lifetime of small observations folded into instinct. He watched the sun climb and fall, and noted where it stood at particular hours, sometimes with the aid of a simple wooden disc, notched at its edges, that some scholars would later call a sunboard, a device pressed flat in the palm, tilted just so, its shadow measured against carved lines to suggest a bearing when the horizon offered nothing else to trust. It was not precise in the way that later instruments would be precise. It did not promise certainty, but it offered a kind of conversation with the sky, a way of asking the sun a question and receiving, if the day was clear enough, something like an answer. Beyond the sunboard, there were the birds. A captain who had spent his life along these waters knew that certain species did not stray far from land, that their presence overhead in the middle of open water suggested a coast nearer than it seemed, that their direction of flight in the low hours of morning or evening often pointed toward the place they meant to return to, which was, more often than the sailors could explain, the place the sailors wished to find as well. Gulls behaved one way, gannets behaved another. A raven, released from a cage aboard ship, as the old sagas claimed some captains once did, in moments of true uncertainty, might wheel once over the water and vanish toward land. A living compass with wings, trusted not because it was infallible, but because it was better than guessing. Whether such stories were memory or embellishment, the underlying practice they preserved was real. Sailors watched birds, because birds knew things that men on the water could not. They watched the waves as well, and this was perhaps the subtlest of all their arts. The open ocean was not a single uniform surface, but a shifting register of different swells, some born of distant storms, some shaped by the pull of unseen currents, some altered by the presence of land long before that land came into view. A trained eye could distinguish the crossing patterns where one swell met another, could sense the way water behaved differently near a coast than in the deep water beyond it, could feel through the hull itself a change in rhythm that spoke of shallows ahead, or of a great mass of rock rising unseen beneath the surface. This was knowledge held not in words but in the body, in the balance a man kept as he stood on a moving deck, in the way his knees and spine had learned over years to translate the sea's motion into meaning. And there was colour. The water itself changed depending on what lay beneath and around it. A deep, cold blue where the ocean ran undisturbed and vast. A greener, more turbid hue where a current carried sediment from some distant river mouth. A strange pale cast, sometimes visible on the horizon, that experienced sailors associated with ice fields lying beyond sight. reflecting light back up into the sky in a way that betrayed their presence before they were ever seen directly. This was called, in later centuries, ice blink, though the Norse who first learned to read it gave it whatever name their own tongue provided, now lost along with so much else that passed from father to son and never reached parchment. The color of distant water, the particular quality of light reflected from clouds low on the horizon, the smell carried on wind that had passed over kelp beds or nesting grounds. All of it entered into the captain's calculations, woven together into a single continuous act of attention that never fully ceased, waking or sleeping, for the whole duration of the voyage. This knowledge did not arrive with the captain of the ship, now cutting west from the fjord. It had been given to him, piece by piece, across years of standing beside older men who had themselves stood beside older men still, learning not through instruction so much as through proximity, through the accumulated experience of watching a teacher's face change at some subtle shift in the water that the student had not yet learned to notice. He had been corrected as a boy, told he was wrong about a bearing, made to sit through storms not as a passenger, but as an apprentice expected to observe and remember. And once he had commanded ships of his own, the sea had gone on teaching him in its own indifferent way, presenting him with situations no lesson had quite prepared him for, forcing him to test what he had inherited against conditions the inherited knowledge had never precisely anticipated. This was the nature of Norse navigation, not a fixed system memorized once and applied forever, but a living, adjusting practice, tested and retested against an ocean that refused to repeat itself exactly, voyage after voyage, year after year. On a clear night, far from any coast, the ship became something closer to a small world, suspended between two vast darknesses, the black water below and the deep, star-strewn sky above. And it was here that the captain's knowledge found its fullest expression. The stars wheeled overhead in their slow, patient arcs, and a man who had spent enough nights beneath them could read in their positions not just direction, but the passing of the hours, could know, without any other measure, how much of the night remained before the grey beginning of dawn. The wake of the ship, disturbed by the passage of the hull through cold water, sometimes glowed faintly with a strange green-white light, a phenomenon born of countless tiny creatures stirred into brief brilliance by the ship's motion, and the sailors who watched it trailing behind them in the darkness felt, whether or not they had words for it, that they were moving through something alive, something that noticed their passing and answered it with light. The wind on such nights had a particular cold clarity, a bite that reached through wool and skin alike, carrying with it the mingled scent of salt and tar and the damp wood of the hull. And the men not on watch pulled their cloaks tighter and pressed closer to whatever warmth another body could offer, while the man at the helm stood alone with the stars and the compass of his own trained memory, adjusting the angle of the ship by fractions too small for anyone else to notice. It was on such a night, clear and cold and full of stars, that the captain first felt the change. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have alarmed a less practiced man. Only a slight alteration in the wind's direction, a few degrees at most, arriving not as a gust, but as a slow turning, as though some vast unseen hand had begun, almost imperceptibly, to rotate the whole sky. He said nothing to the crew. He simply watched the sail a little longer than he might otherwise have done, felt the angle of the wind against his cheek, and let his eyes drift toward the horizon in the direction from which the change seemed to be arriving. There was nothing there yet that words could describe as danger, only a thin band of haze low against the stars, faint enough that another man might have mistaken it for cloud, or for nothing at all. But the captain had seen such haze before, in other years, on other voyages, and he had learned, painfully in at least one case, that it was rarely nothing. He adjusted his stance at the tiller. He said a single word to the man nearest him, low enough that it did not carry to the rest of the crew, and that man rose without question and went to check the lashings on the cargo. His movements unhurried but purposeful, the practiced motion of someone responding to an order whose full meaning he did not need explained. The rest of the crew slept on, or watched the stars, or spoke in low voices about matters that had nothing to do with weather. And the ship continued forward through water that remained, for the moment, calm. Centuries later, long after the age of the Longship had passed into memory and myth, scholars and sailors alike would return to these questions with a kind of hungry curiosity, wanting to know whether such navigation without instruments was truly possible, or whether it belonged more to legend than to fact. They built replica ships from timber-shaped, according to excavated originals, and they sailed these vessels across stretches of open ocean, using nothing but the methods the sagas and the archaeological record suggested the Norse themselves had used. Sunboards, star positions, the reading of swells and birds, and the color of water. Some of these experiments succeeded remarkably well, guiding modern crews across hundreds of miles of open sea to landfalls not far from their intended targets, lending real weight to the old stories. Others revealed the limits of the method, the way a cloudy week or a sudden fog could strip a navigator of nearly every tool available to him, leaving him to rely on nothing more than dead reckoning and the accumulated instinct of years. What these later voyages confirmed, again and again, was that Norse navigation had never been magic, never been some mystical certainty passed down intact and infallible. It had been observation, patiently gathered and constantly tested, imperfect and human, capable of extraordinary accuracy and equally capable of failure. And it was this very fallibility, this reliance on a trained man's judgment rather than on any fixed instrument, that made the captain's quiet unease on this particular clear night worth taking seriously. Not as certainty of danger, but as the accumulated wisdom of a life spent learning to notice, before anyone else could, when the sea's disposition had begun, however slightly, to change. The change did not announce itself. It arrived the way most changes at sea arrived, in increments too small to name until they had accumulated into something undeniable. The swell, which had been long and slow and easy beneath the hull since morning, began to shorten. The troughs grew deeper without growing wider, so that the ship seemed to labor more for the same distance traveled, rising and falling with a new effort that the rowers felt first in their shoulders, before anyone spoke of it aloud. The captain, standing where he had stood for most of the day near the mast, felt the shift through the soles of his feet, transmitted up through the keel in a language that had no words, but that he had spent 30 years learning to read. Above them, the sky had begun its own quiet transformation. The high, thin clouds that had streaked the blue since dawn thickened, drawing together at their edges, losing the loose, scattered character they had held for hours, and taking on instead a heaviness, a grey that crept in from the western horizon like a tide of its own. The light changed with it, growing flatter, losing the sharp clarity of morning, so that the sea itself seemed to darken, not because the water had changed, but because the sky above it no longer gave it anything bright to reflect. The gulls that had followed the ship since the last headland, hoping for scraps, wheeled once more and then turned back toward land, vanishing into the haze, and their absence was noted by more than one man aboard, though none remarked on it until much later, when there was leisure again for such remarking. The wind, which had been steady and companionable from a quarter that let the sail do most of the labor, began to shift and strengthen in small pulses, gusts that pressed harder against the wool and then eased, then pressed harder again, each cycle slightly stronger than the one before, like a hand testing the give of a rope before committing its full weight. The captain watched the sail's edge flutter, watched the telltale ripple that ran along its lower hem when the wind bit at an angle it had not held before, and he gave the order, without urgency, to bring it in a reef, to shorten the cloth against what was coming. The order passed down the ship the way all his orders passed, without shouting, spoken at a volume that expected to be heard, because the men expected to be listening. Two of the younger crewmen went to the lines, working the sail down by practiced degrees, their hands moving over wet wool that had begun, in just the last hour, to darken with spray thrown up from waves that were themselves growing taller, breaking now instead of simply rolling, their crests catching the wind and scattering into fine mist that drifted across the deck like a cold breath. The timbers had begun to speak. They had spoken all voyage. In truth, the low conversational creak of overlapped planking working against itself. The small groans of a hull designed to flex rather than resist. But the register had changed. The sounds came faster now and deeper, a new strain audible beneath the familiar one. The ship's whole body working harder to absorb forces. It had not been asked to absorb since it left the fjord. The captain heard it and did not startle at it, because he knew the ship had been built to make exactly this sound under exactly this kind of pressure. That flexibility was the design and not a flaw in it. But he heard it, and he counted the strokes of it, the way a man might count another man's breathing to gauge his condition. Cargo that had ridden loosely through the calm hours was drawn tighter now, the crew moving among the sea chests and bundles with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this before, lashing down what could shift, wedging what could not be lashed, checking knots they had checked that morning, as though the checking itself were a kind of prayer. Water had begun to find its way over the low sides with the larger waves, not yet in quantity, but in occasional sheets that ran across the deckboards and drained back through the seams. And two men took up positions near the bailing buckets without being told to, because every man aboard had learned early in his life which jobs waited for an order and which jobs simply needed doing. The rain arrived not gradually, but as a decision the sky seemed to make all at once, the first drops fat and separate, striking the deck and the men's shoulders like small stones. And then within the space of a few breaths, becoming a driving, needle-fine assault that came in nearly sideways on the strengthening wind, finding the gaps in cloaks and the folds of hoods, running down necks and into boots, cold in a way that had nothing gentle in it. The waves, which had been breaking politely at their crests, began to break more fully, their tops folding over and crashing down the ship's flank, sending water across the low sides in surges that no longer felt occasional, but continuous. A rhythm the crew adjusted their footing to without conscious thought, bracing wide, keeping one hand always on a line or a rib, the ship's rolling motion sharpening beneath them into something that required constant correction rather than easy accommodation. The sail, reefed though it was, strained hard against its lines, the mast groaning in its socket with each gust, the whole rigging singing under tension in a high, thin note that rose and fell with the wind's own pulses. The captain watched it with the particular stillness of a man measuring risk against necessity, weighing whether to take the sail down entirely and trust the ship to the oars and the storm's own mercy, or to keep just enough cloth up to hold a course that might yet bring them clear of the worst of it before full dark. He held that decision a while longer, watching, and the crew watched him watching, because in weather like this, a captain's face carried more information than the sky did. Among the younger crewmen was a boy on his first long voyage, no more than 16 summers, whose hands on the bailing bucket had gone stiff, not entirely from cold. He worked steadily enough, matching the rhythm of the man beside him, but his eyes went too often to the horizon, to the black wall building there, and his breathing had taken on a shallow, hurried quality that had nothing to do with the labor of bailing. He said nothing. There was no room in the ship's narrow world for a boy to say what he felt, not because anyone would have mocked him for it, but because there was simply no use in the words, no action they could produce that was not already being taken. The older sailor beside him, a man with a beard gone grey and a face weathered into something like the hull's own planking, noticed anyway, the way old sailors notice such things without needing to look up from their own work. He did not offer comfort in words either. Instead, he began, almost under his breath, to speak of another storm, years past, off a different coast. Worse than this one by his account, though every old sailor's worst storm was always worse than whatever storm was presently occurring. And this was itself a kind of comfort, a signal that the sea's fury, however large it loomed in the present moment, had been met before and would be met again. He spoke without drama, the words coming between the strokes of his own bailing, a low, steady recitation that asked nothing of the boy except that he keep working, keep his hands moving, keep his place in the rhythm that held the whole crew together. The boy's breathing slowed, not because the story reassured him in any specific way, but because the voice itself, calm and unbroken, was a kind of anchor in a world that had begun to pitch and heave beyond anything he had known. He found his rhythm again, matching his strokes to the older man's, and something passed between them that neither would have named, an unspoken understanding that fear was permitted, even expected, so long as it did not stop the hands from their work. This was the bond the ship had built into every one of its crews across every voyage it had made, a bond forged not in words, but in shared labor against a shared danger. Each man's competence a kind of promise to the others that he would not fail them, that whatever came, they would meet it together, in the same boat, breathing the same salt air, bound by the same thin walls of oak and pine between themselves and the black water below. The captain, watching the darkening horizon, the racing scud of low cloud, the whitening crests that stretched now in every direction he could see, made his decision without announcing the weighing of it. He called for the sail to come down entirely, called for the oars to be shipped, called the rhythm that would carry them, not toward harbour, for there was none within reach, but toward the posture a ship takes when it means to survive rather than to progress. Bow into the worst of it, speed matched carefully to the wave's own pace. Every man's strength given over now to the single, unglamorous work of keeping the vessel's nose pointed where it needed to point, and enduring. The oars had been lashed before the worst of it came, tied down along the sheer strakes where the rowers usually braced their feet, because a loose oar in that wind was a spear looking for a target. And the captain had seen men lose fingers, lose eyes, lose their footing entirely to a shaft of ash suddenly given its own violent will. Now the crew worked without them, hands turned instead to bailing, to gripping, to holding lines that had become the only difference between staying aboard and not staying at all. They worked in shifts, though the word suggests an order that the storm did not permit for long. Men bailed until their arms would no longer answer them, then were pulled back by whoever stood nearest and replaced by whoever could still lift a bucket. And no one kept count of whose turn it was, because counting was a luxury belonging to calmer water. The captain had not left the tiller since the sail came down. He would not leave it again until the sky told him he could. His hands had gone past cold into something else, a kind of thick unfeeling that made him look down at his own fingers now and then just to confirm they were still closed around the wood, because he could no longer trust the sensation alone to tell him so. The tiller fought him with the whole weight of the sea behind it, twisting in his grip as the stern lifted and dropped, and he held it the way a man holds a thing he has decided will not be taken from him, not through strength alone, which was failing, but through a stubbornness that had settled into his shoulders and did not consult his strength for permission. Around him the night had become a single continuous sound. The wind's scream and the water's roar merged into one voice that had no beginning and no pause, and within that voice smaller sounds rose and vanished. A man's shout cut short, the crack of something giving way forward, the hollow slap of a wave taken broadside, before the bow could be brought round again. There was no comfort in the noise, but there was, strangely, a kind of company in it. The way any vast and indifferent thing can feel less lonely than a small and personal silence. The ship groaned with every timber, and the men had come, by that point in the night, to read the groaning the way they read each other's faces, listening for the difference between the ship complaining and the ship warning. Their hands had stopped being hands in any way that felt familiar. Salt had worked into every crack of skin, into the beds of fingernails, into the small cuts that rope always leaves on men who work it without gloves. And the sting had passed, hours before, into a deeper ache that did not localize itself to any one place, but sat instead across the whole body, a dull, insistent burning that the cold water did nothing to ease and everything to worsen. Eyes stung worse. The spray came sideways, came from below as often as above, flung up off the crests by a wind that seemed to enjoy finding the one unguarded angle a man had left. And there was no wiping it away that lasted more than a moment. So the crew simply learned to see through the sting, to keep their eyes narrowed to slits and trust the shapes they could make out. The mast, the gunwale, the shoulder of the man beside them, without expecting anything sharper than shapes. Cold had stopped being a sensation with edges. In the first hour of the storm, a man might have said his feet were cold, his hands were cold, and meant something specific by it. By the deep of the night, there was no longer a report to give. The cold had become the condition of being alive in that place, as constant and as total as the dark. And what a man noticed instead were the small rebellions his body still attempted against it. A shiver that came up through the legs and rattled the teeth. A stiffness in the jaw that made speech difficult. A heaviness in the limbs that whispered, quietly and with no particular urgency. That lying down might not be the worst thing, might in fact be rather peaceful. And it was this whisper, more than the wind or the water, that the older men watched for in the younger ones. Because they knew it for what it was, and knew that a man who began to agree with it needed to be shouted at, struck if necessary, kept moving by whatever means served, until the whisper lost its argument. Small losses came the way they always come, in weather like that. Not as single catastrophes, but as a series of little thefts, each one absorbed and then forgotten, because there was no room to mourn any one of them for long. A barrel of water, lashed near the mast, tore free of its binding when a wave took the ship broadside for a moment before the tiller could answer, and it went over the side without ceremony, without even much sound beyond the crack of the rope that had held it, and the men who saw it go had time only to register the loss before turning back to the work that had not paused to let them watch it happen. A line meant to steady the yard, coiled and secured days before under a calmer sky, parted somewhere in its middle with a sound like a bone breaking, and the two ends of it snapped away into the dark and were simply gone. And someone further aft found new line by feel alone and set to replacing it without being told. Because in that kind of night the work announced itself, and a man either did it or he did not. There came a moment, the captain would speak of it later, on calmer water, with the particular flatness men use for things that frightened them badly, when the ship very nearly broached, a wave larger than its neighbours, or simply arriving at a worse angle, caught the hull along its length rather than at the bow, and for the length of 2 or 3 heartbeats, the whole vessel tipped further onto its side than it had tipped all night, far enough that the deck itself seemed to fall away beneath the men's feet, far enough that water came in over the sheer in a solid sheet rather than a spray, and every man aboard felt, in that stretched and silent instant, the specific terror of a ship that has stopped fighting to stay upright and begun, instead, to consider going over. The captain threw his whole weight against the tiller, called no order because there was no order to give beyond the one his body was already attempting. And the bow came round, slowly, reluctantly, as though the sea itself had to be persuaded to release its grip, and the ship righted with a lurch that threw two men to the deck and left every rib in every chest aching from the breath they had all, without noticing, stopped taking. In such moments, men prayed, not loudly, not in any organized chorus, but each in his own low mutter. Words meant less for the ears of the gods than for the comfort of the mouth that shaped them. Thor's name came up often, called on the way a man calls on a friend known for his temper, but also for his loyalty. The god of the thunder and the sea's rough moods, asked half in genuine appeal and half in the resigned humor of men too tired to be entirely serious, to turn his attention elsewhere for a while, to spend his anger on some other coast. Hands went to the small carved amulets that many of them wore against their chests. Hammers of bone or bronze, worn smooth by years of exactly this kind of gripping. And they held them now not with the expectation that the metal itself could still a wave, but because the holding gave the hands something certain to do when everything else in the world had become uncertain, and because faith, at that hour, was less a doctrine than a rope thrown to a drowning thought. But even as they prayed, most of them understood, in the plain and unsentimental way sailors understand such things, that the sea was not truly listening, that it was not, in any sense that mattered to the men gripping the oars, an angry god to be placated, but something older and less personal than any god, a condition, a fact, a force with no more malice in it than the cold has malice or the dark. The sea did not hate them, it did not know them, it would take the ship or it would not, and no prayer changed the calculation, only the men's ability to endure while the calculation ran its course. This understanding did not stop the prayers. It only sat alongside them, the two truths, that the gods might be listening, and that the sea listened to nothing at all, held together in the same exhausted minds without contradiction, because a man in a storm has no time to resolve his theology and no need to. The turning, when it came, did not announce itself. There was no single wave after which the others were smaller. No moment a man could point to afterward and say, "There, that was when it broke." Instead, the fury simply began, by degrees too slow to notice in any one stretch of minutes, to loosen its grip. The wind's scream lost some of its highest note first, dropping into something merely furious rather than something that seemed intent on erasing the ship entirely. The waves that had been climbing over the gunwales in solid sheets began, instead, to merely spray, and then, later still, to merely rock the hull with the memory of their earlier violence, rather than the violence itself. The men noticed before the captain said anything, because the men had spent the whole night reading the water with the specific attention of those whose lives depended on the reading, and one by one they lifted their heads and looked toward the east, where the black had begun, so gradually that no one could say when it started, to soften into a grey that was not yet light, but was no longer wholly dark either. Dawn came uncertain, the way it comes after any long violence, grey and reluctant, and offering nothing so generous as warmth, only visibility, only the slow gift of shapes returning to the world. The mast standing where it had stood, the exhausted faces of men who had not expected, an hour before, to see any face again. The waves themselves settling into something merely large rather than something monstrous. Spent now, rolling long and heavy and indifferent under a sky the color of wet stone, as if the storm that had tried all night to take the ship had simply grown tired of trying, and moved on to some other coast, some other captain's white knuckles, some other crew's whispered names of gods. The men did not speak at first. They simply stood, or sat, or knelt where the last wave had thrown them, and let the strange stillness settle into their bones the way water settles into dry wood, slowly and completely, until there was no part of them that did not feel the change. The wind that had screamed all night through the rigging now only breathed, small and almost gentle, as though embarrassed by what it had done. The ship rocked in long, easy motions, the same timbers that had groaned and shuddered through the dark, now moving with a kind of exhausted grace, like an animal that had run until it could run no more, and now only walked, head low, sides heaving. The sail hung in ruins. What had been a proud rectangle of wool, dyed and woven by hands that would never know what winds it would face, was now a torn thing, flapping in ragged strips from the yard, more shadow than sail. No one moved to repair it yet. There would be time for that, when arms remembered how to lift rope again. For now it simply hung, a banner of what the night had cost, and the men glanced at it the way one glances at a wound before deciding whether it needs tending or only watching. One of the great oars, the one on the port side, near the stern, the one old Kettle had manned for 11 years without complaint, had cracked clean through in the worst of the pitching, when a wave had driven the ship sideways and the oar had caught the full weight of the sea against the hull. It lay now in two pieces, one still fixed in its port, the other rolling loosely in the bilgewater, with the rest of what the storm had shaken free. A broken chest, a coil of rope gone to a knot no living hand could untangle, a boot that belonged to no one anyone could name. The men checked each other in silence, because words had not yet returned to them, and because there was a kind of reverence in silence that speech could not offer. A hand on a shoulder, a look held a moment longer than necessary, a count, made without seeming to count, of faces present and faces missing. This was how sailors mourned before they allowed themselves to know they were mourning. Not with cries, but with the quiet arithmetic of glances, tallying who stood, who breathed, who had made it through the night that had tried so hard to end all their nights together. It was the captain who first said the name. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as though testing whether the world would answer. Halfdan, the rope handler, the young one, barely 20, who had lashed himself to the mast 3 times through the worst of the pitching because his hands would not hold otherwise. No one had seen him go. That was the strange, terrible mercy of a storm at night. It did not announce its takings. It simply took and left the living to discover the absence only when the light returned and the counting began. And one man's place at the oar sat empty, and no one could say when, exactly, in all that black chaos, the sea had finally pulled him free. The captain did not weep, not where the men could see it. He was a man who had learned, across many voyages and many losses, that grief carried openly by a captain became a weight the whole crew must carry, and that a crew already exhausted by storm and labour had no strength left to carry anything more. So he carried it alone, in the set of his jaw, in the extra moment he spent looking out at the water where Halfdan had likely gone under, in the way his hand tightened once, briefly, on the gunwale before he turned back to the business of the ship. Sagas would later remember captains for their fury in battle, their cunning in negotiation, their luck in trade, but rarely for this, the private, unwitnessed grief of a man who had promised, in some unspoken way, to bring every soul home, and now had one less soul to bring. The cargo, too, had suffered. Furs that had been carefully bundled and oiled against the wet, now floated, ruined, tangled with the broken chest that had held them. A portion of the grain, meant for trade in some distant port, had gone soft and briny, unsellable, a season's careful accumulation surrendered in a single night to water that did not care what value men had placed on such things. These were losses that would be felt not in the moment but later, in the tallying that happened on land, in the debts that would go unpaid, in the winter that would be leaner for it. The sea did not distinguish between a man's life and a man's cargo. Both were simply things it could take, and it took what it wished and gave back only what it did not care to keep. By mid-morning, the water had gone glassy in patches, strange stretches of near stillness between the long, slow swells, as though the sea itself were resting after its labor. The light, still grey, had softened at its edges, and here and there a weak brightness suggested the sun somewhere behind the clouds, unable yet to break through, but trying. Wreckage drifted past the hull in the hours that followed, a length of splintered wood that might have been theirs or might have belonged to some other ship, some other storm, some other crew whose fate they would never know. A scrap of cloth, unrecognizable now, spinning slowly in an eddy. Once a single oar, whole and untouched, floating past with a strange dignity, as if it had simply decided to leave its ship rather than be broken by the sea, and now sought a new one. The gulls returned first, before any word of land, before any sighting of coast. They came from somewhere unseen, circling the mast with harsh, ordinary cries, settling briefly on the broken yard before startling off again, indifferent to what the night had meant to the men below them. Their return was, in its way, the first sign that the world had resumed its usual shape, that storms ended, that gulls still hunted, that the business of living continued even in the wake of so much that had nearly ended. The men watched them with something between irritation and gratitude, too tired to decide which. Such storms, when they were survived, entered the memory of a crew in a particular way. Not as a single sharp image, but as a texture, a smell of salt and fear that would return unbidden years later, at the sound of wind against a hall's timber roof. And when such storms were not survived, when a ship failed to return at all, they entered instead into the sagas, transformed by retelling into something both larger and stranger than what had likely occurred. The sagas remember such voyages, not always by ship's name, for ships were rarely named with the care given to men, but by captain, by cargo, by the particular horror of some detail that had lodged in memory. A storm off the coast of Iceland that swallowed 3 ships in a single night, remembered generations later in verses that named the drowned by their fathers' names. A voyage to the Western Isles that simply ended, no wreckage found, no survivors returning, to tell what had happened, so that the saga could only say that they sailed and were not seen again, and let that silence stand as its own kind of ending. The historical record, imperfect and scattered as it is, confirms what the sagas gesture toward. Archaeologists working the coastlines of Scandinavia and the British Isles have found timbers, fragments of hulls, sometimes no more than a few ribs of oak, buried in silt or peat, carbon dated to the centuries when longships crossed these waters routinely, their origins and fates entirely unknown. No name survives for these wrecks, no saga claims them. They exist only as evidence that a ship was built and sailed, and did not return to any harbour that kept a record long enough to reach us. Some scholars believe the true number of Viking vessels lost to open water may be far greater than any text suggests, for the simple reason that a ship lost with all hands leaves no one behind to tell the story. Only perhaps a wife who waited a season too long, a farm that passed to a brother when no word came, a memory that faded within 2 generations into nothing more than a name mentioned rarely, and then not at all. This was the quiet arithmetic of a seafaring age, that for every voyage remembered in verse, there were surely others swallowed entirely, storm and ship and crew together, leaving no mark on any shore, no fragment in any peat bog yet uncovered, no line in any saga to mark that they had lived at all. The ship in this telling was fortunate, bruised, diminished, grieving, but afloat, still bearing its crew toward whatever coast waited beyond the grey horizon. But every man aboard understood, in the silence that followed the storm, how easily it might have gone otherwise, how thin the margin had been between the story they would tell in some haul years hence, and the story that would simply never be told, because no one had lived to tell it. For now there was only the glassy water, the gulls circling, the broken oar rolling gently in the bilge, and the long work of putting a wounded ship back into some semblance of readiness for whatever remained of the voyage. The men set to it slowly, wordlessly, the way men work when grief has not yet found its proper hour, mending what could be mended, discarding what could not, and casting one last look, now and then, toward the water where a friend had gone, as though the sea might, in some final mercy, give back what it had taken. It did not. The sea rarely does. It only rolled on, vast and indifferent, carrying the ship forward into a day that had, despite everything, decided to continue. It was on the third morning after the storm that the smudge appeared. No one aboard could say afterward who saw it first. Perhaps it was the boy who had lashed himself to the mast 3 nights running and had not slept since, his eyes gone raw with salt and watching. Perhaps it was the captain himself, standing at the prow with the particular stillness of a man who has learned not to hope aloud. Whoever it was, the word passed through the ship in a murmur rather than a shout, land, spoken almost as a question, as though the speaker did not yet trust his own eyes, or the sea's willingness to permit such a thing after what it had just taken. At first it was nothing, a discoloration along the rim of the sky, grey against grey, indistinguishable from cloud to any eye less desperate than theirs. The men said nothing more for a long while, only watched, the way one watches a fire that might be dying or might only be resting. The ship rode on, indifferent to their watching, the sea beneath her calmer now than it had been in days, but still carrying the memory of violence in every long, slow swell. By mid-morning, the smudge had resolved into something with edges, cliffs, pale and vertical, rising out of the water like the walls of some drowned country reclaiming itself. Behind them, lower and softer, the suggestion of hills. The light was doing what light does along unfamiliar coasts, shifting, deceiving, making the land seem nearer than it was, and then, cruelly, farther, so that the men's hearts rose and fell with the tides of their own perception before the ship had gained a single true mile. It was past midday before the cliffs gave way to something the eye could name with confidence. Trees first, a dark stippling along the higher ground, wind-bent and stubborn, the kind that grow where the soil is thin and the winters long. Then lower, the pale scattering of what might have been rock or might have been dwellings, impossible yet to tell. And then, rising thin and grey against the paler grey of the sky, so faint that several men doubted it before admitting to seeing it at all. Smoke. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant hearths. Hearths meant people. And people meant that the world the storm had tried so hard to erase was, after all, still populated, still going about its business of cooking and warming and living, entirely unaware that a battered ship of grieving men was easing toward its shore with salt-cracked lips and eyes that had forgotten, these last days, how to look at anything but water. The captain gave the order to strike the sail, and the men rowed the last distance in the old rhythm, the one bred into their shoulders since boyhood. Though every arm aboard ached with a soreness that went beyond muscle into something more like sorrow. No one spoke of the man they had lost. There would be time for that later, on solid ground, when grief could be given its proper shape instead of being folded, as it had been these 3 days, into the work of simply staying afloat. The harbour, when it revealed itself, was narrow and well hidden, the kind of inlet that a coast keeps close and does not show to every passing eye. A slot of calmer water between 2 arms of rock, deep enough for a keel, sheltered enough that even the storm's leftover restlessness could not follow them fully inside. The ship eased in slowly, oars shipped at the captain's signal, the men peering now with a wariness that had little to do with the sea and everything to do with what waited on land. For land, however welcome, was never simply land. It belonged to someone. It had its own quarrels, its own memory of ships that had come before, some bearing trade, some bearing steel, and the people watching from whatever settlement lay beyond the tree line would have no immediate way of knowing which this one was. The crew understood this without needing it said. Weapons were not drawn, but neither were they stowed far from reach. Eyes that had spent 3 days scanning the horizon for the storm's mercy now scanned the shoreline for figures among the trees, for smoke that might signal warning rather than welcome, for any sign that the exhausted men aboard this ship were sailing into a second peril before the first had fully released them. It was the historical truth of such moments, one that later ages would flatten into simpler stories of raid or trade, as though a ship's arrival always announced itself plainly as one or the other. That landfall was rarely so simple. More often it was a slow negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. The ship's posture in the water, the number of men visible on her deck, the presence or absence of shields hung along her sides, all of it read by watchers on shore the way sailors read weather. A wrong gesture, misunderstood, could turn a trading voyage into a battle before a single word was exchanged. A right one, patience, an open hand, goods laid visibly on the deck rather than concealed, could turn strangers into hosts, at least for the length of a single tide. This ship, weary and short, one soul, had little appetite for anything but the second outcome. The captain ordered the shields left where they hung, unremarkable, and had 2 of the calmer men stand forward at the rail where they could be seen clearly by anyone watching from the trees. A wordless announcement that this was a crew seeking harbour, not conquest. Whether this was received as such, no record says for certain. But the ship was allowed to come in unmolested, to find her place along the shallow shelf of rock that served as a landing, and to settle there, hull grinding softly against the stone in the particular hush that follows a long ordeal's ending. The men did not rush ashore. There was, in the moment of arrival, a strange reluctance in several of them. The body's slow unlearning of the sea's motion, and something else besides, a kind of disbelief that solid ground could still exist, that the world had not, after all, become entirely water and grief and grey light. It was the captain who stepped down first, his boots finding purchase on stone that did not shift beneath him, and for a moment he only stood there, swaying slightly out of habit, his hand resting on the ship's flank as though in thanks, or perhaps apology. The people of that shore came slowly, as people do when uncertain what a ship's arrival portends. First, a boy, sent ahead by older eyes to see what manner of visitors these were. Then, when no violence followed his approach, a handful of men and women emerged from among the trees, watching with the particular stillness of those who have learned that curiosity and caution must be held together in the same hand. What followed was not dramatic. History remembers the raids, the burnings, the longships beached beneath a sky lit orange with some captured haul's destruction. But far more often, in the long record of such voyages, landfall meant something quieter, an exchange conducted in gestures and broken fragments of language, goods laid out on cloth or bare earth, furs and iron traded for grain or salt, or simply the right to rest, a night on land that was not one's own. The Norse who sailed these waters were, as often as they were raiders, also traders, settlers, seekers of new ground for crowded farms back home. And a shore such as this one, hidden and modest, was more likely to see barter than battle. So it was here. Whatever words passed between the ship's crew and the shore's people, however clumsy or halting, They arrived eventually at something like understanding. A meal was shared. Fish and bread of a coarser grain than the men were used to, and a drink that stung going down but warmed afterward, in a way that felt, after 3 days of storm-soaked cold, almost like mercy. The captain sat among strangers whose language he did not speak, and found that grief and gratitude required no translation. A woman of that shore, noticing the rawness in one sailor's hands, brought a salve without being asked. A boy showed another the trick of a local knot used for mending nets, and the sailor showed him, in turn, a Norse knot for securing rigging, and for a few minutes the two crouched together over a length of rope, entirely absorbed, the storm and its losses forgotten in the small, complete world of a shared task. One man, his name lost now, as so many are, walked alone along the shoreline that evening, away from the fires and the murmured half-conversations, needing something the company of others could not give him. He walked until the sounds of the camp grew faint, until it was only the water's steady breathing against the rocks and his own footsteps in the wet sand. And there, in that solitude, he allowed himself finally to feel the shape of what had been lost 3 nights before. A friend, a shipmate, a name he would carry home to be spoken among people who had never met the man but would grieve him anyway, in the particular way that sailors' families grieve, having always known this cost was possible and never quite believing it would come due. There is a peculiar intimacy in arrival after peril of this kind, a sense that the world, having so recently and so completely narrowed itself down to the ship and the storm and the water underneath, suddenly widens again, all at once, into strangers, unfamiliar bread, a shoreline that belongs to someone else's memory rather than one's own. The men who stepped off that ship were not the same men who had boarded her in the fjord. Some now carried grief they had not carried before, and all carried a fresh understanding of how little separates a voyage's safe ending from its opposite. And yet, the widening itself was its own kind of gift. Proof, however small, that beyond the grey water there remained a world large enough to hold both loss and welcome in the same breath, and generous enough, on this particular shore, to offer both. Not every ship that left a fjord that spring, or any spring in that long age of sail, would come to know such a shore. For every vessel that found welcome on some unfamiliar coast, there were others whose ending no one ever witnessed, whose final hours belonged only to the sea itself, recorded nowhere but in the slow silence that followed when the expected date of return came and went, and then came and went again, and then ceased to be spoken of as expected at all. The Viking Age, as it would later be named by those who studied it from a great distance of centuries, was built upon the assumption of the sea's cooperation. Trade depended on it. Raiding depended on it. The settling of new lands, the carrying of brides from one fjord to another, the movement of iron and amber and walrus ivory and slaves and silver, all of it required that men trust hulls of oak and joints of iron rivet to carry them across distances that no one aboard could have crossed on foot or would have survived attempting. That trust was not always rewarded. The sea then, as now, made no promises, and kept none that had not been extracted from it through skill, luck, and the accumulated wisdom of those who had read her moods before and lived to describe them. How many ships failed to return will never be known with any precision. The record-keeping of the age was not the record-keeping of a later era. There were no registries of departure and arrival, no insurers tallying losses, no newspapers to announce a vessel overdue. What exists instead is a scatter of evidence, sagas that mention, almost in passing, a ship that set out and was never heard from again, place names that seem to commemorate a loss without explaining it, grave markers raised for men whose bones lay elsewhere, in water too deep or too far to recover, and, more recently, the physical remains of the ships themselves, drawn up from fjord beds and burial mounds by archaeologists who approached the wreckage not as tragedy but as testimony. The Oseberg ship, lifted from a burial mound in Norway in the early years of the 20th century, was not a vessel that vanished at sea. She had been deliberately drawn ashore and buried with great ceremony, a grave ship for women of high status, her timbers preserved for over 1,000 years by the blue clay that had sealed her in darkness. And yet, in her preservation, she offers something almost as valuable as a wreck would have. Proof of exactly how such ships were built, plank by plank, rivet by rivet, how the keel was shaped and the mast was stepped, how the oars were fitted and the rigging arranged. She is not a ship that failed the sea. She is a ship that succeeded in being remembered, which is its own kind of rare fortune, denied to the great majority of her kind. The Gokstad ship, found not far away and lifted from her own burial mound a few decades earlier, tells a similar story of a vessel honored rather than lost. Built for a chieftain, buried with him, her timbers strong enough that later replicas of her design were sailed across open ocean in the modern age, to prove what the builders of 1,000 years before had already known. That a ship of this shape, however small she might look beside the steel hulls of later centuries, could cross a sea that seemed impossibly wide if the hands aboard her understood what they were doing. But for every Oseberg, for every Gokstad, drawn gently to shore in an old burial rite and preserved by chance and clay, there were vessels whose ending left no mound, no careful burial, no ceremony at all. Only a hull settling slowly onto a seabed, far from any fjord, its planks spreading outward as the iron rivets corroded and the joints gave way, until what had once been a longship became a shape in the silt, a pattern for future divers to trace with careful hands and slower patience than the builders had ever needed. Marine archaeologists, working in later centuries with instruments the Viking Age could not have imagined, have found such shapes in cold water from Scandinavia to the coasts once visited by Norse trade and raid alike. A rivet pattern here, a section of keel there, cargo scattered in a rough line that suggests the ship broke apart while still moving, driven by wind or panic, or both toward a shore it did not reach in one piece. From such scattered evidence, historians have learned to read a wreck the way a saga teller once read a storm, assembling meaning from fragments, filling silence with informed inference, resisting the urge to claim more certainty than the evidence allows. A cargo of soapstone vessels and iron ingots, found together on a seabed far from where either material was produced, tells of a trading voyage interrupted mid-journey. A cluster of weapons alongside domestic tools suggests a ship that carried both raiders and settlers, or perhaps a single crew equipped for either purpose, depending on what they found when they arrived, if they arrived at all. Saga fragments, however unreliable in their exact details, sometimes preserve the memory of a specific loss, a named ship, a named captain, a storm described in language clearly meant to be remembered rather than merely reported. Evidence that the loss had mattered enough to someone, in some fjord, to be spoken of long after the men themselves were gone and the details had begun to soften with retelling. What the historians and the archaeologists cannot recover, no matter how carefully they measure the rivet spacing or catalogue the cargo, is the experience of waiting. That belongs to the fjord villages themselves, and it left no artifact behind, no timber or clay to preserve it. Only the shape of a story passed down, if it was passed down at all, through generations who eventually stopped expecting an answer. A ship that left in early spring, bound for a summer of trade or raid or exploration, was expected home by a certain turn of the season. Before the ice returned, before the light grew too short for safe sailing, before the goods carried aboard her began to matter more as memory than as merchandise. When that expected turn of the season came and the ship did not appear on the water beyond the fjord's mouth, The women and the old men and the children who remained behind did not immediately conclude the worst. Ships were delayed by weather, by opportunity, by the simple slowness of trade negotiations in a foreign port. A season's delay was not unusual. 2 seasons began to weigh differently on those who counted them. There is no way to know how many households in how many fjords endured that particular arithmetic. 1 season, 2, the slow transition from expectation to hope, to something quieter and harder to name, a waiting that had stopped anticipating an answer but had not yet become grief, because grief requires an ending, and an ending was precisely what the sea had refused to provide. Some families eventually held a kind of memorial without a body, raised a stone with a name and a brief description, died at sea, or simply gone, lost on a voyage east or west, or wherever the ship had last been known to be heading. And in that stone found whatever closure could be found without confirmation. Others, it seems reasonable to imagine, never quite arrived at even that. The uncertainty simply persisted, generation folding over generation, until the specific loss blurred into a general understanding that the sea had taken someone once, long ago, and no one alive still remembered exactly who or exactly how. This was the other face of the maritime confidence that built longships and sailed them to Iceland and Greenland and the coasts of 100 foreign kingdoms. For every voyage that returned with cargo and stories and profit, there was some fraction, impossible now to calculate, though clearly substantial enough to be woven into the era's own understanding of itself, that simply did not return, and whose absence became its own kind of historical fact. Less documented than a successful voyage, but no less real for the families who lived inside its consequences. The sea, through all of this, kept an accounting that was entirely its own, indifferent to the distinction that mattered so much to the humans who sailed across it. A voyage completed and a voyage lost were, to the water itself, simply 2 outcomes among many, no more or less significant than the tide that rose and fell regardless of who or what rode upon it. The storm that sank one ship and spared another chose between them by no principle that could be reasoned with or petitioned against. Not virtue, not skill, not the fervency of a prayer offered before departure. Sometimes the better-built ship went down, and the poorly maintained one limped home intact, and sailors who had spent their lives reading the water's moods knew this well enough to hold their confidence loosely, understanding it as skill applied to probability rather than mastery, achieved over an element that could, on any given crossing, simply decide otherwise. This indifference is, in its own way, the most enduring lesson the longships have left behind. More enduring, perhaps, than the trade routes they opened, or the settlements they founded, or the raids that reshaped the coastlines they touched. The sea did not care whether the men aboard a given hull were skilled or unskilled, devout or careless, bound for glory or already resigned to disappointment. It simply received them, carried them, and returned them or did not, according to patterns too vast and too indifferent to be read as judgment. The ships that came home were not rewarded for virtue. The ships that did not return were not punished for failure. They were simply caught or spared by forces that had been moving long before any longship first cut water, and that would continue moving long after the last one was drawn up onto a beach and left to rot quietly into the sand that had once launched her. There is a haul now, in a country that no longer measures its days by the tides of raiding season or the turning of a longship's prow toward unfamiliar coasts, where one such vessel rests in the hush of climate-controlled air. Her timbers dark with the particular blackness that only centuries of buried peat and careful excavation can produce. Visitors move around her in slow orbits, speaking in the lowered voices that museums seem to require, as though the ship herself might wake if addressed too loudly. She does not creak. She does not shift with the memory of swells. She rests on a cradle built to hold her weight evenly, to keep her from settling into the kind of collapse that gravity would otherwise, patiently, insist upon. Her sail is gone, her ropes are gone. The men who once stood at her oars are gone in every sense that matters, their names lost, even if their bones were somehow recovered and catalogued in a drawer nearby. What remains is the hull itself, the long dark curve of oak that once knew the weight of water sliding beneath it, the rivets of iron that have gone the deep orange-brown of age, small constellations of rust marking where a shipwright once drove metal through wood and trusted that the joining would hold against forces he could imagine but never fully calculate. The prow, if it survives at all, is often the most eloquent fragment, the carved head of a serpent or a dragon, its features softened by time, its aggression rendered almost tender by 11 or 12 centuries of patient decay. It was carved to frighten, to announce the ship's arrival to anyone watching from ashore, to suggest that something ancient and hungry had come out of the mist to claim what it wanted. Now it sits behind glass or rope, admired by children who ask their parents what it means, admired by scholars who measure its curves and compare them to other carvings found in other burials, admired by no one who fears it any longer, because the fear it was built to carry has evaporated, along with everything else that made the ship a living thing rather than an object of study. And yet something remains in the wood that resists reduction to mere artifact. The grain still holds the pattern of trees that grew in forests, now vanished or transformed. Oaks felled by axes, wielded by men whose hands are dust, shaped by tools whose edges are rust, according to a design passed down, not in books, but in the bodies of shipwrights who learned by watching their fathers and would teach by being watched in turn. The ship, even silent, even motionless, even surrounded by museum placards explaining her construction in clinical detail, still carries some residue of the intention that made her, the desire to move across water, to carry men toward horizons, to return, or not, according to forces no one aboard could fully name. Look closely enough at the hull, and you can see where waterlines once sat, faint marks of wear that speak of countless mornings when she rode low with cargo or high with empty holds, of years when she carried grain and years when she carried raiders, of voyages recorded nowhere but written, in their way, into the very grain of the wood that bore their weight. There is a peculiar humility in this kind of evidence. No dramatic tale attached, no captain's name inscribed, no saga verse composed in her honor. Only the accumulated testimony of use, of a vessel doing precisely what she was built to do, over and over, until she was retired, or wrecked, or given to the earth in a burial mound where some chieftain hoped she would carry him onward into whatever waited after death. Some ships were burned. Some were sunk deliberately to block harbor channels against invaders. Some simply rotted where they were beached, forgotten by descendants who no longer needed them. Their timbers scavenged for other uses, their iron rivets pulled and melted down into tools that served entirely different purposes. Only a fraction of what once sailed the northern waters survives in any form at all, and what survives does so mostly by accident, buried in mud that starved the wood of oxygen, sunk in cold water that slowed decay to a crawl, sealed beneath the earth of a burial mound where a king or a wealthy farmer wished to be sent into the afterlife. The same way he had once crossed the sea in a vessel built for the purpose, surrounded by the things he might need on a voyage no living witness could describe. It is worth pausing here on what this means, that the ships we know best are largely the ships that never sailed again after a certain point, the ones deliberately given to burial rather than continued use, or the ones lost to accident and preserved by the very disaster that ended their service. The ships that succeeded most completely, that carried their crews out and back across decades of ordinary voyages. that simply wore out through years of honest use and were broken up for scrap or left to rot on some forgotten beach, left far less behind them. Success in this telling is invisible. It leaves no wreck to excavate, no burial mound to open centuries later, no dramatic story of loss for historians to piece together from fragments and speculation. The longships that we can stand before today in museum halls are, in a strange way, the failures. The ones that did not complete their working lives at sea. The ones interrupted by death, by ambition, by the deliberate choice to send a man and his ship into the earth together. And so what we know of the Viking Age's material culture is filtered through disaster and ritual, through interruption rather than completion, and the ordinary success of 100 nameless voyages is represented, if at all, only by the wear patterns on hulls that happen to survive for other reasons entirely. There is a kind of peace available in this thought, if one is willing to sit with it rather than resist it. We are accustomed to wanting resolution, wanting to know which ships were lost and why, wanting names attached to disasters, wanting the full accounting of who sailed and who returned and who vanished into weather that swallowed every trace of their passing. But the sea does not keep such records, and neither, for the most part, did the people who sailed upon it. They left runes on stones commemorating sons who died in the east or in the west, in vague geographies that could mean almost anywhere within a vast arc of possible destinations. They left sagas composed generations after the events they described, shaped by the needs of storytelling as much as by any commitment to strict accuracy. They left burial mounds containing ships whose voyages we can only guess at, whose captains' names we will never recover, whose crews are represented, if at all, by scattered bones and the corroded remains of weapons buried alongside them. The record is incomplete, not because anyone failed in their duty to preserve it, but because completeness was never the point. The ships existed to serve the living, to carry cargo and warriors and settlers and traders across water that connected one shore to another. And when that service ended, whether through gentle retirement or violent loss, the ship's purpose was fulfilled either way. The absence of a full accounting is not a tragedy. It is simply the natural condition of things that existed before anyone thought to keep exhaustive records of them. Things whose value lay entirely in their use rather than in their documentation. This is, perhaps, the deepest truth that a longship at rest in a museum hall can offer a quiet listener drifting towards sleep. That human ambition, however vast, however confidently it sets forth across dark water toward unknown shores, exists within a scale of time and force that dwarfs it almost entirely. The sea does not remember the names of the men who crossed it. The wood does not carry inscriptions explaining its purpose to those who find it centuries later. What we are left with, when we stand before these ships, is not a resolved story, but a suspended one. A hull, a prow, a scattering of rivets, and an enormous unspoken context of voyages, taken and voyages lost, that will never be fully recovered, no matter how many burial mounds are opened, no matter how many wrecks are located on the floor of some cold northern sea. And there is a strange comfort in accepting this incompleteness rather than fighting against it. Not every question needs an answer to be worth asking. Not every ship needs a fully known fate to be worth remembering. The not knowing is, in its own way, a form of respect, an acknowledgement that some things belonged entirely to the people who lived them, and that we, standing centuries later in the quiet of a museum hall or lying in the dark of a bedroom, listening to a voice describe what little remains, are visitors to a story that was never ours to fully possess. Picture, then, one final image, and let it be the last thing carried into sleep. A fjord at night, moonlight scattered thin and silver, across water gone perfectly still, the mountains rising black on either side, holding the silence the way they have held it for longer than any human memory extends. And there, moving across that water without sound, without wake, without any disturbance to the stillness at all, the ghost of a longship glides forward, her oars dipping in a rhythm that no living hand commands, her prow cutting a line through mist that closes behind her as quickly as it parts. She does not announce herself. She does not appear to have any destination beyond simply continuing, gliding, dissolving slowly at her edges until the mist has taken her entirely, and the fjord holds nothing but water and stone, and the moon's long reflection, unbroken now, exactly as it was before she came, and exactly as it will remain after every ship, real or imagined, has finally been allowed to rest. If this kind of quiet history, of ships and water and the slow uncovering of what the sea chooses eventually to give back, has settled well with you tonight, you are welcome to find more of these calm chronicles gathered gently on this channel, whenever you wish, with no hurry at all.